Hi, my name is Fadhel Kaboub. I teach economics at Denison University in Ohio in the United States, and I'm the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. It's my pleasure to join you today virtually, and I was asked today to give a few remarks on the concept of economic and monetary sovereignty, and I'd like to highlight the importance of mobilizing productive capacity for economic resilience and the importance of leveraging the power of the state and the sovereignty of the state in regulating market power. So when we talk about economic sovereignty or sovereignty in general, sovereignty is multidimensional, multifaceted. I'll just focus on a couple of aspects of sovereignty. There's territorial sovereignty, which most people are very familiar with. There's the legal sovereignty, meaning the state is able to introduce a constitution, domestic laws, sign international treaties, and so on. There's digital sovereignty in the realm of privacy and security. But most importantly, for our purposes today, the idea of economic sovereignty. And within it, there is a very important concept, which is the focus of my discussion today, which is the concept of monetary sovereignty. And I will argue that monetary sovereignty is something that a country can acquire or achieve if it can invest strategically in food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, especially renewable energy sovereignty today, and technological sovereignty, industrial sovereignty. So there's other dimensions of sovereignty which I will not discuss today. I'll just zoom in on the concept of monetary sovereignty. So I talk about the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. Not all governments have the same degree of monetary sovereignty. Some governments have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, like the United States, Japan, Canada, and so on. And some countries have no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. Think of African countries who use the CFA currency, the franc CFA. They have no monetary sovereignty because they can't issue their own currency. They can't control their own currency. Most countries in the global south, countries like Tunisia, have a limited degree of monetary sovereignty. And what limits the monetary sovereignty of the state is the level of external debt that the country has, that is debt denominated in foreign currencies. And of course, when you have high levels of external debt, you're obliged, in a sense, to fix your currency or stabilize the value of your currency relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. So the idea of fixed exchange rate also limits the degree of monetary sovereignty. And of course, very important takeaway point here is that monetary sovereignty, it's not something that the state can declare by decree. It's something that you actually acquire with strategic investments, with strategic policies over the long term. So the idea here is for countries like Tunisia, for example, to be able to move from the lower end of the spectrum of monetary sovereignty to the higher end of the spectrum. What are the kinds of strategic investments that need to be put in place? And as I suggested here, it's really these investments in food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and technological sovereignty that will be the key principles for moving to a higher degree of monetary sovereignty. And the benefits of acquiring a higher degree of monetary sovereignty is creating additional fiscal policy space that allows the government to spend more on national priorities without causing inflation, without bankrupting the country, without causing currency depreciation. So here's how most traditional economists think about this. They say governments spend tax revenues, they can borrow up to a certain limit, so disciplined by market principles. But what I'm suggesting here is that there's this additional fiscal spending capacity that we are not tapping into. It's not infinite. Notice this yellow space is limited, it's constrained by the risk of inflation. So the challenge here is to determine the risk of inflation, identify the inflation pressure points, and then introduce policies to push the risk of inflation further out and expand that additional spending capacity in order to invest strategically. So when you think of inflation risks, there's two factors. One is the lack of productive capacity. That is when we don't have the technology, the physical resources, the skilled labor, the know-how, the logistical capabilities, the supply chains capabilities. Those are the real limits that cause inflation risks when you have additional government spending. The second factor is also important, which is what I call abusive market power. When you have some key players who can act as price setters in the system and raise prices and cause inflation simply because they can. So the strategy here is for us to do two things. Number one, you invest strategically to build additional productive capacity. And number two, you tax and regulate this abusive market power out of existence. And when you do that successfully, you're actually expanding that bright yellow space and pushing the risk of inflation further out, therefore creating a higher degree of monetary sovereignty and creating the additional fiscal spending capacity. That's really the paradigm shift that I would like to introduce here in terms of thinking about monetary sovereignty, and as a result, the economic sovereignty that ensues from it. And it's important because in the global south, countries like Tunisia, we have key deficiencies, structural deficits that produce high levels of external debt that limit our monetary sovereignty. And the root causes, as I identified, are the energy deficits that we have, the food deficits, the food imports that we have, and the low value added content of industrialization that we typically pursue in the global south. And these create structural traps because the trade deficit lowers the value of the dinar, the value of your currency, which creates a situation where all the food and fuel imports and medical imports become more inflated. So you're importing inflation, and that forces the central bank to intervene artificially to fix the exchange rate by accumulating more external debt, and forces the government to subsidize food and subsidize fuel and so on. And that creates these structural traps that we can undo with these strategic investments in food, in renewable energy, and in a higher value added content of manufacturing and industrialization. I'll give you a quick example and I'll close here. So if Tunisia today decides we want to spend 2 billion dinars, but we spend those 2 billion dinars strategically, 1 billion dinars on health and education, for example, let's say it's a national priority, and it is a national priority, but also spend the second billion dinars on increasing domestic productive capacity of food, of renewable energy, energy efficiency, crack down on corruption, on abusive price setters, importers of luxury goods via taxation and regulation. If we do this, yes, it's a substantial increase in government spending, but look at the consequences. We have fewer imports of food and energy over time. We have lower trade deficit, a more stable or even stronger exchange rate because of the improvement in the trade deficit. You have no pass-through inflation effect. We're not importing inflation because we're producing more of these resources domestically. You have a lower external debt and a higher credit rating from credit rating agencies, increases in foreign currency reserves, and more resilience to external shocks in terms of food and energy security. And you have a lower carbon footprint, of course, more employment, less brain drain, and improved quality of life for everyone. And now we're talking. Now that we figured out how to spend 2 additional billion dinars without causing inflation, as a matter of fact, reducing the risk of inflation, the question becomes, is 2 billion dinars the limit? Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 7. What determines the limit of this additional spending is, again, the risk of inflation, which means the capacity of the state to logistically and administratively to implement this additional spending strategically, to crack down on corruption, to make sure you have the logistical capabilities to introduce these additional investments and monitor the implementation of these strategic investments. That's what determines the real limits to government spending. That's what determines the real risks of inflation, not some artificial number that is imposed by the IMF or by any traditional kind of approach to thinking. So this is really the main point I wanted to deliver today. I'm happy to answer any questions by email or on social media. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be with you in person, but hopefully this will be the beginning of a longer conversation. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks.